Indeed, Julia. Now moving on to education, my colleague Professor Andrew George, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Education International at Brunel.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this really important debate. Education, I've been asked to focus on higher education in particular, though some of what I will be saying will refer to education more broadly. And I'm going to be looking at some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that Brexit really faces us in education with. And I think these challenges and opportunities fall into two categories. One, which we're concentrating a lot on at the moment, are the practical issues. But the second is one about mindset, almost an existential question about what is education for at universities. And actually, I think that might have a much deeper effect in the long run. I think it's worth us remembering, how did universities start in Europe? So the oldest university in Europe is Bologna. What that started was a group of students from individual countries setting up groups that they called nations in order to protect themselves from the city authorities actually fining them vicariously for the crimes of their fellow citizens. And these groups or nations then started hiring scholars to educate them. And then soon, what happened was that these nations came together to form a universitas, a university, the first university that then started hiring more scholars to do the education and started to be big enough and powerful enough to negotiate with the city authorities. So at the very heart of what a university is a coming together of nations. And that, I think, is deep within us, and that's why I'm saying that some of the big issues for us are beyond the practical issues, but are actually about our mindset. But let's start with the practical issues. The debate around higher education as opposed to research, but the debate around the education element is really dominated by two things. It's dominated by student numbers and by student mobility. We can't forget the other things as well. Actually, across the United Kingdom, as far as is possible, I'm going to illustrate this with figures from across the UK, not just concentrating at Brunel. Across the UK, nearly 11% of professors come from the EU. Nearly 14% of senior lecturers come from the EU, that is outside the UK. In Brunel, our overall figure is actually 12%. What we can't forget as well, though, is that at many universities, and that's actually at Brunel, a greater proportion of our academic staff come from outside the EU as well. We also can't forget, and Professor Jeff Rogers will be speaking about this next, is the impact on our research. And that in fact, as a university, our education mission is inseparable from our research mission. And so these two things will interact, but I will leave Jeff to talk about that. So looking at the student numbers first of all, in the UK at the moment there are nearly 125,000 non-UK EU students at the moment studying in the UK. That makes up about 5.9% of the total student body within the UK. This means that EU students, non-UK EU students, are worth around about £7.5 billion to the UK economy and support about 35,000 jobs across the UK. Let's put this into context, though, with our overseas students. 125,000 non-UK EU students. We have roughly 312,000 students from outside the EU. And actually about 90,000 students alone from China. So EU provides a substantial proportion, a really important part of our student body, but actually there are many other students from around the world. But I think one of the things that's not fully recognised is that these students are actually distributed unequally in various ways across our institutions. So the average number, as I've said, is 5.9%. If you look at Imperial College, it's 16%. LSE is 18%. London Business School, 18%. Cranfield, 25% of their students come from outside the UK, but within the EU. And what's interesting is certain sectors seem to be particularly hard hit. So if you like the universities that are around creative arts, actually, interesting, have a very high proportion. Royal College of Art, 24%. Royal Academy of Music, 21%. We also need to think about contrasting that with the number of our UK students who study abroad. Very difficult to get accurate numbers on this one, and the only accurate numbers I can get are slightly out of date, 2012, which suggests that 28,000 of our UK nationals study substantially for their degree abroad. A pittance compared to the number coming in. I actually think a shameful pittance compared to the number coming in. And of those, most go to the USA, followed by Australia, with France and Germany coming third and fourth. The other bit is around student mobility. Looking at student mobility, Erasmus is a scheme that funds and allows students and staff to study across Europe, now rolled into Erasmus+. What's been very pleasing about this is that the number of UK students who are willing to spend time in Europe and spend time in Europe has been increasing in the last few years. And so in 13-14, the last year we have figures, just though about 15,500 students from the UK spent a considerable proportion of time in the UK as part of their studies. That's up 6.8% in 1 year. That contrasts to 27,000 coming in. So these give us some crude figures at the population level, but again, I also want to talk about this inequality of what we're talking about. How about some universities and some areas are particularly practically at risk? And so if you look at engineering and technology, look at the number of overseas or EU outside the UK students studying that 33%, 26% in law, 22% in mathematics, 20% in computer sciences. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the practicalities of this fall unevenly across it. And there certainly are some programs, some universities who are going to be very, very dependent upon EU and overseas students. So what's the impact of this is going to be? Well, of course, we don't know, in spite of what the Prime Minister tells us, we don't know what Brexit is going to be. Who would have predicted that Marmite would be the first victim of Brexit, at the time of the referendum? I don't recall anyone mentioning Marmite in any of their lectures or talks about the referendum. At the moment, of course, EU students get to study here with the fees at the home rate and also have access to student loans, in contrast to overseas students who get charged fees at a higher rate and have no access to UK loans. And it seems inconceivable that that arrangement will continue. So that means in strict business terms, we will lose something between 0 and 100% of our EU students. To balance this, we may get fees from others. We may choose to modify our fees to overseas students or to non-EU students to compensate. So this would be a major headache at the population level, probably survivable, but as I've already pointed out, in some areas it's going to cause problems, major problems, and that there may be some programs, some areas of study which are of strategic importance to the UK, which will struggle to survive without those students. Thinking about things in terms of Erasmus, we might still be able to participate in Erasmus. We don't know yet. There are 33 countries involved. This includes Turkey, though Switzerland has been suspended following their referendum to limit the migration of EU nationals into Switzerland. So there are major practical issues, and we as a university and other universities are needing to face those and are needing to plan for those and make strategic plans to deal with them. But I would argue actually that our main loss, as I've already hinted at the beginning of this talk, is about our international and global outlook. As I've said, being international is at the heart of what universities are for and is at the heart of what our education should be. Academics, researchers, students are often naturally impatient of where national boundaries should be and are very happy working and needing to work across those boundaries. We need to generate students who have a global outlook. We need to generate students who have a global outlook because that is their future and that is also the future of this country or whatever other country they choose to serve in. And so we need to make sure that we keep that global mindset as part of it. So how do we go forward? Well, we need to mitigate some of the potential disbenefits of Brexit, but we also need to look at some of the opportunities offered by the New World Order. One of the things I think we need to remember, and that's already been picked up by some of the earlier talks, is the strength of the UK higher education system. We've got to be careful that we don't talk ourselves in a funk into something where we start looking as though we are the victims and that we need handouts and all the rest of it to survive. We've actually got to be proud of the fact that the UK, as the Vice-Chancellor said this morning, is in the top 1 or 2 with the United States in terms of international education. We need to be proud of the fact that the quality of the UK higher education is recognised and attracts students from around the world. We need to maintain that quality, and we need to stay on the front foot when we're talking about that. As part of the narrative, of course, we can also turn round and try and use this narrative to talk about being more open to the rest of the world. In actual fact, emphasise the fact that we are willing to attract students and staff from around the world, wherever talent is, wherever there are people who will benefit from us or from association with us, we need to attract those people. Clearly, there need to be some internal government conversations, and the Amber Rudd type talk at the Conservative conference is not helpful in this regard, but there are clearly still divisions within the government which need to be sorted out. I also think we need to be getting on a positive front foot here and saying that universities have a lot to offer in this debate. As Will has said, we need to be global in our outlook. We need to be willing to go out there and trade with other countries in order to not just survive, but to thrive. Universities are not only part of that trade, but they can also produce students and graduates who have the mindset to go out there and deal with different cultures, make deals, and help build this country. The other thing I think that's coming out is this narrative around that we need, that Julia actually alluded to in the last talk, is thinking about the skills that the UK needs, and some of the government rhetoric that we're hearing around self-sufficiency, for example, Hunt talking about medical doctors. And I think we need to think more deeply about how is it that these strategic subjects that we have, these strategic programs we are failing to attract UK students into them. And I think that's a challenge to us, because in fact many of the solutions don't lie within the universities, they will lie within the schools and our relationship with the schools and how we and business and schools work together to create pipelines so that we can attract bright and able students into areas that at the moment we are failing to do in the numbers that we would like to do. I think the third thing we need to do is we need to start making links with EU universities. I think you could argue that as a sector in the UK, we've perhaps been complacent about that. Actually, at Brunel, we have very good links with European universities. But as a sector, some universities perhaps have been complacent about that. And I think that we now need to really forge really strong bilateral and network relationships. Next week, I'll be very pleased to be at the first international meeting conference of the YERUN, which is a group of young European research universities, where we really will build a link. And the enthusiasm, and I think one of the strong positive things that's come out of the whole of the Brexit debate has been the fact that our European partners, after an initial shock, have often been phoning us, emailing us, wanting to work with us, and not wanting this to be deleterious about our relationship. And the final challenge I'm going to raise is actually, I think, a challenge that Sir Geoffrey very articulatedly talked about in his talk, which is in actual fact, I think that many of us woke up when we woke up over the days following the Brexit to realise that in actual fact some of the basic fundamentals that we have thought are important in this country about the benefits of globalisation, the benefits of free exchange of ideas and skills, of collaboration across boundaries, things that we seem to think were evident were actually things that were either not shared by the rest of the country, or a large proportion of the country, or were not seen as important as we saw them. Now, of course, not everybody who voted to Brexit also sees these as unimportant, but I think that what we can't deny is that the Brexit vote has revealed the fact that there is a disconnect in our society. And I think that universities have had a role to play in that disconnect. We have perhaps not emphasised enough, not looked enough at our role in society. And I think that we've got to work out in our education how we reach out in our education, both to listen to the wider society and to remain in contact with that wider society, which it seems that at least a large proportion of it we've drifted away from, but also to take part in that debate and to interact with that debate so that we can influence it, so that we can help raise the skill base and the attitude base and the success of people in this country and people in other countries to contribute to global problems and help solve them. Thank you.